Welcome back to our last session, and this is the panel discussion. Always an opportunity to ask questions, to have debates. We presented a lot of material in the previous session. And also welcome to our online guests checking in. We've received great questions also. We went through those, so we also want to deal with some of those, and I'll also pose them to the panel. Before we start with the panel discussion, we've introduced Jeffrey and Tracy. We haven't introduced Wandile. So Wandile, thank you very much for being on the panel. Well-known economist, journalist, also writing a lot, Wandile, and chief economist at Agbiz. So thanks very much for joining us at the panel. It's a great privilege. And also to our guests here in the studio or in the auditorium, please ask us questions. So this is a time for open discussion, for debating. I want to start off this session just with some initial reflections. So if we can just have a minute or two, Wandile, if we can start with you maybe, and then Jeff to you, just some initial impressions of the baseline in 2021, if you can share that with us and to get the debate going.
Yeah, thanks Fedi, and thanks to BFAP again for a wonderful resource that you produce every year. I think for me, there's a couple of things here, but there's one consistent running theme. If you think back from the inception of BFAP, we're still chasing this story that there is a potential that's out there to expand South Africa's agricultural production. And we all agree on the natural resources nicely mapped up on the baseline. But I think the key point that we need to zoom in is to say, what are some of the specific interventions that we need to make in each and every one of those value chains to actually be able to see that progress? And I think the baseline did attempt to bring up all of those points. And again, I congratulate BFAP on doing that. And I think then as we go to Jeff, he will also maybe speak to us a little bit about saying, what is the department thinking in line, particularly for those interventions that do not need fiscal support, but rather more of the legislative tweaks to actually get that momentum going. And I think the baseline really gave us some bit of a roadmap on how to build onto that. And I think it's a useful document.
Thanks very much, Wandile. Jeff, if you want to fill in that. So regarding, and I think this speaks also to implementation, Wandile. I think our question around, there are some of these that are really, that feel that it can be done and it can make a big difference. How can we implement, how can we move forward on that?
Thank you very much. I think, implementation has been a challenge over the past couple of decades. We've been good in producing good strategic plans, good strategic documents, and I think the implementation part has been lagging, and we've been advocating for strategic partnership between government and the private sector. But I think somewhere there is some misunderstanding. Maybe the trust issues needs to be sorted out. However, I think with the opportunities presented through the AAMP, the Agriculture Agro-Processing Master Plan, as you indicated there in one of your slides, where it provides good insight and opportunity as to where government can intervene, where the private sector can intervene, and where both government and private sector can jointly intervene. I think that is a very good way of laying the foundation. But it's also critical to also understand how government and private sector operate and so on, because translation of a plan into a funded plan into implementable program, that is another step which probably becomes confusing and frustrating for the private sector parties, because they probably that is the part that is not well understood. And I think we need to break that barrier, because I think that is where we'll find it harder to say, after the plan, what are the next steps that government follows to ensure that this plan becomes a program that is implementable going forward.
I think you've touched on a very important point, is the understanding around these processes. Tracy, I'm thinking about the opening of markets. You know, it took 12 years into getting into an export market, and maybe John, you can also come in here and explain some of that. It's difficult. It's not, we've compared that to other Chile they've been very active at opening up those markets. But these processes, there is this process that needs to take time. So I don't know, Tracy, if you want to also come in here. We also have Phumulani to can help us on that. But Tracy, maybe just some comments around that, around market access.
Yeah, I think it's a big issue. I think we've shown that already. We've shown it multiple times. We also discussed it with Phumulani in the side discussion. I think it's, it seems simple, but it's just not. You're constrained by partner countries. You're constrained by the fact that many of them only negotiate about one product at a time, for instance. So you have multiple products wanting to enter one country, and I think the industry's done very well. Something like the Fruit Industry Roundtable, they've got the Trade Working Group, they've prioritized access, they've got a queuing order, everything going. But sometimes it goes beyond that as well. So, some of them get stuck on industries that aren't even related to fruit, because now you're negotiating with a country, they want something in return. So sometimes it's a completely different sector that pops up that now will be influenced. So you're saying that you want access for fruit, but then they want access for meat. And then it becomes a wider, more complicated story very quickly.
Okay. John, do you want to add something to that point on the discussion?
Yes, I do actually. Do I need a microphone?
You can press that button in front.
Yeah, I think the whole thing of market access is incredibly important, but it's also incredibly difficult. We've been engaging through NEDLAC, Tesselica, which is the trade committee at NEDLAC, on market access. And if you look at the policy statement, trade policy statement that Xavier Karim, who's the DDG in DTIC, put out, I shared it with Wandile the other day. I think I should actually share it in our newsletter on Friday. Then you'll understand where governments stand in terms of trade policy. And they are not necessarily driving an agricultural agenda for trade or for exports, because they are protecting textiles and a whole lot of other industrialized products in the process. So there's always this trade-off between products in South Africa. There's always that beautiful graph, that chafe graph, which you guys have used, which shows all our competitors have free trade agreements with China or with a number of Eastern countries, and we hardly have one. And so we're always on the back foot in terms of competitiveness of accessing those markets. Now, this is not going to change fast. Government's whole trade and industrialization policy, because you must see trade and industrialization in the same concept, is much stronger localization and far less export-led growth. I think it should be the other way around in terms of growing the economy. We should be export-led growth and look for opportunities of substitution or localization, but those are far and few between. In agriculture, there's one very good example, the soybeans, through the MSEP program, the Manufacturing Competitiveness Enhancement Program, that drove 2 million tons of crushing capacity, and that created the pool for the production. But we don't have those obvious ones in agriculture. Perhaps oils a little bit, edible oils a little bit, but it's limited. Chickens, Isak and I discussed it a little bit before the time. I don't know where Isak is now, but in the broiler perhaps a little bit. But we must be very careful of overdoing localization, because the steel industry is a very good example. If your protection or your localization means a higher cost, all that it happens is steel goes into so many different sectors of the economy, construction, agriculture, etc. It undermines your competitiveness. So you've got to be very careful as to how you do localization. You've got to do it on a case-by-case basis. This, at the moment, is the big discussion in BUSA and within government at the moment. How do you get that balance right? There are 2 task teams that have been established for this at NEDLAC now.
Excellent. Thanks for that, John. Any further?
I want to just put a point onto this in addition to John's points, because I think that as South Africa in general, I mean, we have had time where we have had a good trade policy focus. Because if you look at the agricultural exports, take, for example, year 2000 up until now, we've made success in opening up as many markets as we can. Our exports grew from around about $2 billion at that time to now where we are over $10 billion. Now the question is to say, how do we go back to that good time where we were able to negotiate productively? And instead of looking at the localization and look at the means to say, how do you stimulate each and every value chain and each and every industry so that it can be able to see some bit of progress, and not necessarily use trade policy as your only industrialization tool across the value chain. And I think that's that blanket statement mistake that we are making, but we could have specific interventions.
Absolutely right. And I think the gap that's created is it's only temporary. So you've got that gap to do some import replacement, but as we all know, the moment that those prices are switching, you're facing basically a price that's 20-30% lower suddenly that you have to compete with in that market as you're switching to export parity. Questions from the audience that at this stage, any point that you wanted to raise at this stage for the debate, and then I wanted to take our first question also from our online audience. So questions from our colleagues here in the auditorium. Any questions that you wanted to raise? Comments? Isak?
Ferry, thank you. What John and myself discussed before this meeting was about import replacement. And I think that the wider definition of import replacement is problematic. But when we talk about illegal trade and unfair trade, and obviously it's well known that we are at the receiving end of that, 90% of all chicken coming into this country is below the production cost and below the cost of export of that particular country. And in our analysis, most of that would be underdeclared or incorrectly declared. Now, there's no win for our industry or the grain value chain when that is allowed. I think that is just a statement. A question I would like to answer ask that we haven't asked is what about SADC, SACU, and Africa Free Trade? The second biggest supplier into the sub-Saharan Africa of chicken is Brazil. And shouldn't that be sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's a very good question. Tracy, do you want to respond to that?
Absolutely, it should be sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes down to, I think we raised it in the presentation, so competitiveness. Brazil is just so competitive at producing meat, and it comes from their competitiveness in the feed sector, in the feed value chain. So it should be us. I would like to think that we can have an advantage in terms of transportation, location, etc. But transporting product by road into the region is also not cheap. And as I said, I think from a production cost perspective, we are definitely at the better end of competitiveness, but we don't produce at the cost that Brazil does.
No, so I think that's also important. It's like I'm just thinking of the Malawi maize price, $145 a ton. If they would put that into a chicken, intensified chicken production broiler operation system, it would certainly make some interesting economics in a production system where we are sitting currently at 220 or 250. So I agree. I mean, there are many opportunities, and I think we need to be obviously aware it's going to be sometimes markets opening, but sometimes also competition coming into play.
Also just to touch on your Malawi point, there's also the volatility to consider. So this year it makes a lot of sense, but then where was Malawi's maize price last year or the year before?
Correct. So you need that consistency of supply.
For a longer term investment, it just makes it difficult.
That's a very, very valid point. I'm looking at the question here, and Jeff, maybe if I can ask you from our online audience, does the figure include land, and they're referring to the plus farms, that table that we showed that the ARC did the report on. Does the figure include land acquired through land reform in SA? What are the main reasons for underutilized land? And does the figure include land acquired through land reform or the resettlement program? So in South Africa. So I think it's all around, if I read this question correctly, it's around what's this figure based on? And secondly, why is it so underutilized? So Jeff, if you can maybe start off first and then Wandile to you, and then if we have some deeper insights also from our audience.
All right. Let me focus on the main reasons for underutilization. We did a study just to find out what are the key challenges for underutilization in the sector. there are many of those. Firstly, issue of coordination from land allocation to post-settlement support. So the two over time have not been linked. So settled farms did not get immediate post-settlement support, which was critical at the point in time. Hence, you find that they are underutilized. Secondly, the required investment sometimes are underestimated, which are required immediately after settling the farms. Obviously, there are all those other issues regarding how settled farms, the social relations with settled groups that also come into play. But key was the issue of post-settlement support, both in terms of grant funding, but also in terms of the required technical support through extension that needs to be provided to those. But in some of the instances, issues of access to productive resources, especially water and infrastructure, other infrastructure, becomes critical because processes of transferring land is also not linked to processes of getting the necessary water rights to the beneficiaries. So that also presents another challenge to these settled farmers in terms of using their land productively. So those are some of the things that are contributing to land being underutilized in the sector. Thank you.
And if you, Jeff, just taking that forward, what's the current plan? If I think about the master plan or is there any change in that approach that we can bring, that we can tie those, get this connection?
There is definitely a change, and in fact, last week there was an interministerial committee meeting chaired by the Deputy President. One of the issues that was raised there was the issue of linking pre-settlement and post-settlement producer support so that we ensure that we align those processes. Because you will recall that during the former rural development and the former DAF departments, we almost had parallel processes and not aligned and harmonized to each other. But now it becomes easy with harmonized structures, approval structures for pre-settlement and post-settlement producer support. So obviously there are strides being made so that there is joint planning of programs, joint or harmonized producer support programs in the department. Thank you.
Wandile, do you want to come in here on the land issue and regard also the question?
Yeah, I mean, on the statistics one, Fedi, I would say somewhat sums those up. I mean, we had looked at some of this work with Professor Johan Kirsten at Stellenbosch, trying to put all of these numbers to say, are these the plus farms, these bought for restitution and all of those things. And I think the numbers begin to aggregate on that. But in as far as the failure or the causes of the failures, I think Jeff spoke to some of the technical ones, but there are also some of the overarching things that if we are, all of us are honest about this, it could be. The first one, on the selection of who gets to benefit on the land reform side. From 1994 up until the end of 2020, there was no clarity on who benefits on redistribution. We knew on restitution, you claim you get on tenure issues, but on redistribution, there was no clear clarity on that. And I think, Jeff, on the point you made in your opening remarks about the beneficiary selection criteria, which emanates from the panel's report, that's a good instrument for the government because now you begin to select the right jockey and the right person where the criteria is clear and they have a better probability of success. That's the one. But I think the overarching thing about the overall government land policy, whereby you still, for example, the government last year in October gave some of the beneficiaries land under 30 years, non-tradable land leases. That means that the state will have to largely back those people with capital throughout. And in the current fiscal constrained environment, you're not going to be able to be assisting those people, especially those you want to enter. For example, Tracy spoke about the horticulture space, the establishment costs, and when the returns will be 8 years, 6 years. Providing finance for those folks is going to be difficult. But I think if we had changed our outlook as a country now on policy to say tradable long-term land rights or title deeds, whatever you want to call it, it begins to change the ball game. But obviously, all of the other points that Jeff spoke to are important: infrastructure, post-settlement support, alignment into training, and all of those things. I think those needs to be addressed. But I think the overarching policy framework on land reform needs to change. That might not be the work of the department. That point goes beyond them. It goes back either to the political party of the country and also just nationally to the lawmakers in parliament. But it's an important point.
Yeah, it's a critical point that you're raising around finances also, the availability to get all of this funding. And without the security or some kind of a leverage on a balance sheet or you need to get private sector in on that level of financing. Otherwise, we're just not going to move forward. So it's a combination of the financing, the beneficiaries, and the security of tenure to finance, especially in the intensive industries. Further questions, comments? Deneen?
So this is for Fadi and Tracy. I was just wondering now, so you said it's the 17th baseline report that you've published, and I was just wondering, based on the data from this year's report, was there anything that you presented that really surprised you in this year's data, where how things have actually panned out has sort of diverged to a large extent from what was maybe predicted 5 or 10 years ago?
That's a very good question. Tracy, you want to go first?
You should go first. I wasn't there 17 years ago.
Yeah, so it's obviously a lot of fun, and you can, because they're online, so you can go and check whether our performance was good or not. And the definition around, we always say, what's the purpose of the baseline? Saying, giving a set of assumptions, we want to create a benchmark that we can measure shocks on. And to say, what's the path ahead? And we know it's, if you look at these lines, I see, Tracy, at least our price lines make some cycles there. Our colleagues, they're running quite flat, the international markets. But the dynamics, the answer around that, Deneen, yes, we do quite a bit of comparisons and trying to understand long-term fundamental trends. And I think that's what we consistently want to do. So the surprises come if long-term trends are changing. If fundamentally things, exchange rate, the reality is it's highly fluctuating, and global prices and the climate. So if I could pick a baseline 2000, I did that little exercise not long ago, I think it was 2010, where we had the exchange rate rapid depreciation. And in that year, if I compare prices, I would want to send you those prices and say, oh, but you see, we got it right. So for us, we're not looking at that, getting the absolute level right, but rather the trend, the fundamental changing trend. So in terms of surprises, I think a surprise for me, and a pleasant surprise, is how fast we have actually seen some of those expansions in high-value crops. To see, if we just think about capital, Wandile, we talked about capital now. Let's just make a conservative estimate that let's talk about 800,000, or for ease of reference, make it R1 million a hectare. Total investment. We're looking at 70 billion rand that went into an investment. Somewhere somebody's financing that, and that's a magnitude, I think, that we need to look at in terms of unlocking growth. So that was, for example, a trend that was faster than what we had. Same direction, but faster in terms of growth. Then a trend that is a surprise to me, and we've talked about this a lot, and Erad and Gerard, you can also add to that, is an industry like sunflower, where we do believe there is value for it in the market, and the area is constantly under pressure. So maybe you could also add to that, Erad, but that's something where 10 years ago, we would say, area under sunflower, there's a place for this cake, there's a oil, there's a market for it. We need to grow and actually at least keep stable, and that area has been declining. I don't know if that answers your question, at least in some of the outlying ones. Tracy, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I think you've covered fairly well. I mean, I think there's many success stories. If you think, we looked at them the other day, dairy is one that's already gone past the NDP targets, for instance. So I think there's a few there that have expanded maybe quicker than what one might have expected, which is great to see. Yeah. That's obviously a fantastic one. And the other thing maybe just is, we keep adding to that bit every year, but this informal economy, as we keep doing more bits and pieces to try and quantify certain sectors in that, you realize how big that is.
I think that's a very important point around the size of the informal sector. More questions? Or comments, observations? John?
I actually wanted to ask exactly on the informal sector, because I think with COVID, the biggest surprise was seeing how big that informal sector is, both in production and into the distribution, the whole food system, if I can call it that way. The question actually to government is, even to Wandile at Stats SA, is how do we capture this data? Because we don't have good data, and because what interventions and how do you design those interventions if you don't have good data? And you mentioned it in your presentation, is that we're going to have to, if we want to be serious about that also in the master plan, we need good data. And I want to know from government, perhaps, how are we going to collect that data, who's going to pay for that data, etc. Jeff, putting you on the spot.
And Stats SA.
Stats SA too. Yes, my good friend. That's the first one. The second one is the issue of concentration. It's going to come up strongly in the master plan, as you know. And most of you would have seen the Competition Commission brought out the report on food pricing, etc. I didn't read the whole report, but I read the statement and the intro, etc. It worries me that they don't have the right context. Your presentations were brilliant, very insightful. I just feel that they should be invited, or you should invite yourselves to them to go and for them to understand how does the sector work globally? How does competition work? Because you highlighted so clearly our competition in with different areas of the world, and unfortunately, concentration plays a scale of economy plays a part in that competition. So I think we need to have a more focused discussion with the Competition Commission on exactly how these things work, because I feel they're not always on the ball in terms of their context. But I would like your comments on that.
Okay, great. So just on that one, John, tomorrow morning the publication's going out. On a concentration, just kind of a bit of a context around agro-processing, agriculture, and relative to other sectors in the economy. Just getting that context and also providing exactly like you're saying, we presented those numbers on agro-processing. My question is, would your investment, it's extremely competitive out there to drive your investment. We're looking at nominal returns of 8 to 10%. Real terms 3-4%. So, and these were tough years in these more recent years. So these suppliers are really fighting to actually achieve profits and to maintain investment. Jeff,
yes,
please come in.
Thank you, John. I think you'll recall that with the producer farmer register, we actually started with the smallholder farming sector in terms of getting that information. However, this financial year, we got an excellent opportunity through the Presidential Employment Stimulus Initiative, where they told us, don't do the normal things that you always do in terms of CAP and the other programs that you have. Think outside the box and be creative. So we used that opportunity to come up with a system, we call it Survey 123. We were able to capture and map with GPS location over 170 subsistence farmers. So this talk to your roadmap, especially in that informal sector, because now, for the first time over the past 2 decades, we are able to actually pinpoint, and we can spatially locate subsistence producers throughout the country. And this is just a portion of the 170 something thousand households, subsistence household, and those are the ones who qualified for the PAYC, the first phase of the Presidential Employment Stimulus Initiatives. So we're going through phase 2 this coming financial year, and we'll be building up on that. But this is limited to primary production. So obviously, the other parts of the value chain needs to come in, and that is where strategic partnership on your roadmap comes in, so that we link now these producers with the markets and with the other actors within the value chain.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Wandile?
Yeah, I mean, John, it's safe to say we have great capabilities on collecting statistics. There's one thing that has been beating us on getting these particular numbers. We don't have the money. And we've actually, as Stats SA Council, come out last year where we put up a statement where we're speaking about some of these things. And in fact, if you were to remember in the early 90s, much of the comprehensive agricultural surveys that were done were partly funded by the National Department of Agriculture then. But over time, that funding dwindled into the Stats SA budget. And obviously, we ran into all of the complications that we saw. And this is why even in the 2017 agricultural census survey, it's incomplete in a sense that it's only just dealing with people that are VAT registered, 500,000 rands over turnover, and everyone less than that doesn't appear on our numbers there. One of the point is this. But there is something positive. Jeff hasn't been briefed on that, because earlier this morning, we met with your colleague Elaine and them from the statistics department, as well as the team that runs agricultural statistics at Stats SA. The key thing that we're trying to establish is this national agricultural statistics strategy. The whole thing is about how do you scrap data sets that are like, for example, the one that you referred to in the farmer registrar, and then how do you, in the process, collaborate with the likes of BFAP in one of the points that Freddie closed on with the transformation stuff, and then how do you combine all of that into formulating a database? The key points now that we are all thinking about is obviously the funding of that particular process, but the ideas are there. Stats SA has the capabilities, but it needs the money to go and back that. But also, to the leaders of agriculture that are sitting in the audience and some joining us online. When we went off, now I'm speaking from the Stats SA side, to do the survey, these folks struggled to get the response also from some of the Commodity Association. And I think next time when they do these surveys and collecting information, cooperation as the industry in general is also crucial in that process of improving our statistics.
Thanks very much, Wandile, Jeffrey. Any more comments, questions? I want to turn, we have another question from the audience. Tracy, this one goes to you. Do you think the sunflower price will break anytime soon? So we know we have high sunflower prices. Will the smaller crop, we should be expecting oil and pellet imports? What effect do you think this will have on the price of local seed?
So I should probably ask you what you think if the price will break soon. You're the one that produces sunflowers. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an international dynamic, so it's hard to answer. There's a lot of weather-related issues in particular over the coming year or two that will play a big role here. I do think there'll be expanded production. How quickly it comes down, I think to a large extent will depend on what the weather's like in the Northern Hemisphere in particular. There's also a bigger structural issue around vegetable oils. If you think, it's not just sunflower, it's sunflower oil, it's palm oil, it's soybean oil.
The whole complex.
It's canola oil, it's that whole complex, and a lot of that sits also in the palm oil sector in particular. Yep. So the plantations are aging, they haven't reinvested. Those are longer term structural issues, and now you've got shorter term issues related to movement restrictions, etc. with COVID that are compounding that. So you've got, they're struggling with labor, they rely heavily on migrant labor, so they're not harvesting as they should. All of that influences, and then you get all this substitution from the other vegetable oil, so it's essentially pulling the whole complex with it. To say it will break anytime soon, I do think it will break, maybe not in the next year, but over the next 2-3 years, I do
We'll
think
see that supply
will come
response
back, yeah.
kicking through.
Obviously, if we do import products, our prices depend on the derived price from the products. So if we import them, it will support local prices. But I think the international dynamics are most important here.
Okay, excellent. We're getting towards the end. I'm looking at the time. Any pressing questions from you in the audience? All happy? Clear? We're good to go? One dealer, back to the panel for last comments or questions. We still have one coming from online, but one dealer, do you first want to make a comment?
No, I mean, I was interested also, speaking about the oil seeds, on hearing even our colleagues from Grain SA. I mean, Dirk looked at oil seeds for a longer period on his views, because I was hearing Tracy and I see him nodding on where he had insights on this issue.
No, we have this right flank here can talk. We've got Erad here, Dirk here. Do you want to add some comments? I know what I did this morning on the sunflower price. There was some trading that could be done.
Yeah, it's like Tracy said. It's the difference between, if you look at something like maize and wheat, you've got an easy view in terms of the commodity because it's quite a straight commodity. But the moment you look at oil seeds, you've got this complex in terms of a derived price that's got products linked to it, and then you've got this bigger complex where you've got different commodities competing in one environment. And that's creating a lot of dynamics. Now, if we talk sunflowers, the questions in terms of the international market is always there, and the questions in terms of what happens with the oil imports and the oil happening locally side. But on the production side, there's a lot of questions as well. And the challenge of the production side is it's not just a price-supply factor. It's also a big weather factor in terms of timing of planting, when you're going to plant. And we know it's a substitute type of planting scenario. The producers will first look at maize, and then they would look at the sunflower space. So the planting dates are creating a different context in it. So it's not just a fundamental in terms of supply and demand and prices. It's also what is available to plant when, and giving our adverse weather conditions in South Africa, it plays a huge role. And we know the challenge going forward for us with sunflowers is that planting dates are linked to the oil content. So there's a lot of work for us in the industry necessary with soybeans, with sunflowers going forward, and the industry is working hard at it. The answer is limited, but the more you scratch and the more you search, the more you get, and I think that's the important part.
Oh, thanks very much. Erad, do you want to add to that?
Very thanks for the opportunity. I think also from a sunflower point of view, your question earlier on is why the industry is not really progressing. And I think the stagnant yields that we're achieving in sunflower, that's where it's a very good illustration of how efficiencies are so important to stay competitive. And sunflower, unfortunately, the yields are stable, whereas soybeans, we've had a big growth. So you have the swap between commodities. Secondly, just from a pricing point of view, obviously with the supply and demand situation in South Africa on sunseeds is really supporting the local sunseed price. It's probably unlikely in the new season that we'll see a big growth in hectares. So that might be pretty stable. The one thing we are seeing, though, from a commercial point of view is that at these really, really high oil prices, in excess of 25,000 in a ton, from a consumer point of view, it's really stifling demand to a large extent. So that's another problem that we're experiencing. Thanks.
So prices are getting at those levels. Thanks very much. Pieter?
Sorry, I think just to what Erad said, and I think this is a result, sunflower has been the stepchild, if I can call it that way, in terms of the speed in which technology is coming to the market, both in terms of biotechnology and also in terms of disease management. And I think that's really the cause why the yields has been hit the ceiling there. So I think the importance is the understanding and the willingness from government to assist with these processes to bring technology faster to the market.
Okay, thanks very much, Pieter. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that comparison that we showed on yields and percentage growth annually over the last 10 years just shows that difference. Any last comments, colleagues? I wanted to invite Aubrey to the stage. Any last comments while Aubrey's coming to the front from our panelists?
Yeah, I think for me, Fedi, is just to thank BFAP and say, the sooner we move with the implementation of the master plan, the better for the sector.
Absolutely. Jeff, from your side?
I fully agree with Wendy there. I think BFAP as a think tank provides that platform for both public and private sector to get insight of the trends of what is happening in the market. And that help in terms of evidence-based planning and also in terms of developing proper strategies that are informed by what is happening on the ground. Thank you, Fred.
Excellent. Thank you very much for participating. I want to close this event by inviting Aubrey to say a few closing words. On that point, Aubrey, again, thank you very much for partnership over so many years. Aubrey is the head of agricultural agribusiness and ABSA. And also in that note, thanking all the partners, many of you in the room who've partnered with us and the BFAP team working very hard at it, our directors. Also, thank you very much to Brand Republic and also to our audience online. Aubrey, you'll have the final word. Thank you very much for doing this for us.
Thank you. Just checking my mic is on. Right, so I think first of all, Ferdi, I've observed something new this afternoon, being the first time that I've attending a hybrid webinar, people coming up with the stairs and everybody very sensitive around their hands, and then they lead in with the elbow, then the fist, and then usually the hand palm open, and then, let's go and sanitize. So I think it's absolutely great that we can have a hybrid event. I think back of last year, the quick adoption of BFAP to have an online event. And then on top of that, if you remember correctly, there was some load shedding. So the event started quite late. But I think for ABSA, it's a privilege to be involved. It's easy with BFAP, professional people, the quality of work, which talk to the ABSA brand as well. So it's actually fairly easy for us. Then I think, just if I can highlight two things, the first one is, the agric performance, and being the star, the shining star in the South African economy. We've had some windfalls in our back, but I think also one needs to be circumspect and say, but there's also been an investment in a clear strategy in the industry over many years. It's not something that happens, that we decide today and it happens tomorrow. Then the second question is, how do we use this momentum, going forward to build an inclusive growth model, as well as, create value for the economy. And I think you've alluded to in your responsibility and involvement in the master plans. I think that talks, and if I interpreted your numbers correctly, if we are able to execute, and I think the clear word is execute on the master plans, there's an opportunity to have a direct growth in GDP for agriculture of 14% over the coming years, which I think is absolutely great. And I think everybody would love to be part of that story going forward. Then, 17 years, Ferdi, it's a long time, and I must thank, the people that came before me from ABSA for spotting this opportunity. And I think, the 17 years involvement, is a testament to our commitment to the sector. We've been in the sector for more than 100 years. We are the biggest commercial lender in South Africa to agric. And it's a very easy discussion in the bank. Capital has become very scarce for a bank, so we need to talk around how do you allocate your capital. And I think for ABSA, agric, easy sector to support. It's performing and it's very important for the economy and for the bank. So I think on that note, let me conclude. Thank you very again for BFAP and Tracy, Ferdi and the team for a marvelous and a good baseline and your broader responsibility and contribution to the sector. We appreciate that. Good luck and hope to see everyone shortly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aubrey. Thank you very much. Excellent.